Good morning. It is Monday, February the 14th. Happy Valentine's Day. And this is The Drill. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. Today, after the Daily Declaration for Spiritual Warfare, the Pledge of Allegiance, and the Star-Spangled Banner, we will have loyalty, hogs and rights, privacy, property, and protest, no free lunch, and gorgeous Mosaic. All that when I come back. Thank you. Ineffable Creator, who out of the treasures of thy wisdom has appointed 3 hierarchies of angels and set them in admirable order high above the heavens, and has disposed the divers portion of the universe in such marvelous array. Thou who art called the true source of light and supereminent principle of wisdom, be pleased to cast a beam of thy radiance upon the darkness of my mind and dispel me from the double darkness of sin and ignorance in which I have been born. Thou who makest eloquent the tongues of little children, fashion my words and pour upon my lips the grace of thy benediction. Grant me penetration to understand, capacity to retain, method and facility in study, subtlety in interpretation, and abundant grace of expression. Order the beginning, direct the progress, and perfect the achievement of my work. Thou who art true God and man, and livest and reignest forever and ever. Amen. Thank you. And now the daily declaration for February the 14th. I have established a covenant of love with you. Though the mountains may be shaken and the hills be removed, yet my unfailing love for you will not be shaken, nor my covenant of peace be removed. I choose you and set my affection on you because I love you. Know therefore that I am the Lord your God. I am a faithful God, and will keep my covenant of love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. I will love you and bless you and increase your numbers. I will bless the fruit of your womb, the crops of your land, the calves of your herds, and the lambs of your flocks in the land that I have given you. You will be blessed more than any other people, and I will keep you free from every disease. No one will be able to stand up against you. You will destroy them. Deuteronomy chapter 7, verses 12 through 24. Prayer declaration. I am convinced that neither death nor life, neither angels nor demons, neither the present nor the future, nor any powers, neither height nor depth, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God that is in Jesus Christ, our Lord. Amen. And that was the Daily Declaration for Spiritual Warfare for February the 14th. Thank you, thank you. Who is the true conservative? He is the person that has the courage of his convictions and is confident in what he knows. He is the person that understands that cultural conservatism is more important than political conservatism. He is not selfish, but minds his own business. He acts like an adult. He is patriotic and uses common sense. He expresses what he knows and does so with certainty. He makes judgments, refuses to speculate, speaks clearly and definitively, and is not afraid to say no. He's open-minded, asking why rather than why not. He is consistent, credible, and influential, not ashamed of his existence, unafraid to learn or correct his mistakes. He is a normal American, and he's better than the socialist. He's a better friend, father, brother, family member, and a better person, period. You have to know that. If you don't know with every fiber of your being that being a true conservative is best, then you're wasting your time. Thank you, thank you. So normally I'm loath to tell stories and do verbal picture painting. I'll read stories, but I don't like to tell stories as a main way of communicating because it's vague and it miscommunicates. The best way to communicate with somebody is to do so directly. But I want to tell a story so that I can illustrate a very, very important point. So I'm at Walmart, and I pull into a parking spot where you can get your groceries delivered to your car, put in your trunk, and then you can drive away. So the guy shows up with the groceries. I get out. I go to deal with that, open the trunk and everything, watch him load them. And I hear this lady start to rag me about her allegedly hitting her car, right? So she is ragging me about it. I'm ignoring her because the tone of voice. If she approached it with a nice tone of voice, excuse me, sir, then maybe I would have turned and talked to her, whatever. But when you're going to start treating me like I'm your bratty 2-year-old, okay, I just ignore you. You're not there. So she wants to comment on that and on and on. So eventually I get out of there and I tell my girlfriend about it. I said, hey, and there's this bitch, and we got out of the car or whatever. I described the events, and I got out of the car and I did this, and she says this and that. And my girlfriend says, in the middle of it, she says, well, did you hit the door? Did you hit the car with your door? And I just stared at her. And I know exactly where this is coming from, and I know exactly where it's going. And so she and I had to have a heart-to-heart over this particular situation. Because what was happening here is she's been brainwashed, like probably almost every American in this country, to be neutral. That every problem is best solved neutrally. And it isn't. It's a fiction. And so that's where that question was coming from. Did you hit the door? Because it really doesn't matter. I did or I didn't hit the door. My point is that she was a bitch, and I'm telling my girlfriend, and that's a relationship. And with relationships, all relationships have expectations of loyalty. Okay? I'm a citizen. Citizen is the description of a relationship I have with my country. Boyfriend is a description of the relationship I have with my girlfriend. Son is the relationship that I have with my parents. Okay? So, and every one of those relationships, there's a certain reasonable expectation of loyalty. Now, too many people in this country think that they have to be neutral and they have to look at things neutrally. George Carlin, the comedian, he gave an interview in which he described this as evolution of his artistry. But anyway, and that's what I had to tell her. I said, look, if you had come to me and said that some woman ragged you or whatever, I'm on your side. I'm going to be on your side. Why? Because you are my girlfriend, not her. You are my girlfriend, and I owe you a reasonable amount of loyalty. And I'm not going to question your story unless there's a damn good reason to do so. You come home late and, you got blood on you and whatever, And then there's going to be the questions of, that's going to be a little bit of a different story. Or we find out that you've been arrested. That's a whole different ball of wax. But in a normal situation like this, a he said, she said situation, I expect automatic loyalty. I've earned that much. And if I hadn't, we wouldn't be boyfriend and girlfriend. And it's a trust issue as well. If you don't trust me, if you think that you have to check me and check all my stories, everything that I say to you, you're going to have to check every single detail, then there's no point in us being together. You may as well take a powder. Now, what also this does is this is part of skepticism, the idea that nothing can be known with certainty. So here you are, and if you're a man or woman, you grew up in the United States, and every time you have a story like mine, where you had a confrontation or a conflict with somebody, and your so-called friend starts taking their side, the other side, starts being neutral, well, what did you do? What did you say? Right? What is the message that's being sent there? Nothing can be known with certainty. And if nothing can be known with certainty, what happens when your sister, your daughter, your girlfriend, your wife gets raped? What happens when they're over at Cosby's motel and they wake up and look up and there's Cosby in a bathrobe looking over them? Their clothes are disheveled. They know that they have at least been molested and very possibly raped. But they also know that anybody they go to talk to about it is going to question them. Well, how do you know? Well, did you have anything to drink? Well, maybe this was part of his lessons. Maybe he was trying to teach you something about being an actress in this kind of a situation. See? They're not listening. They're not listening. They're not loyal. They're not on your side. And if nobody's on your side, who can you talk to about this? You can't even get your status as a victim validated. Right? And how many times do we do that also? She comes out years later when there's other women that are coming out making stories about Cosby. She says, "Me too." And then we say, well, yeah, but this is years later. And so what she deserves, the left says she deserves to be believed. It's different. They're wrong. What they mean to say is she deserves loyalty. Every person on this earth with a relationship to anybody or anything, the government, for instance, deserves a certain amount of loyalty. And we make the presumption for the status quo. And so we assume people are good until proven otherwise. So that means we automatically give them the loyalty. If they abuse that loyalty, then we can withdraw it. If they abuse our trust, then and only then do we go ahead and withdraw that trust. And when we do things on that basis, then when a woman, and I'm sure it's a lot of men that have probably been raped or find themselves in various other similar situations to women who refuse to report it also for the same reason. I'm going to go in, I'm going to talk to people and nobody's going to listen. They're all going to start quizzing me. Well, what did you do? Where did you go? Did you have something to drink? It doesn't matter. None of that matters. None of that matters. None of that matters. Okay? You're my friend. You owe me loyalty. When I come and I tell you that I've been violated, you, as a friend, have got to believe me on the spot, unless you have an obvious good reason not to. You believe me on the spot, and you provide immediate support. That's what you have to do. And if you're not going to do that, then you and I are not going to be friends anymore. Or if we're boyfriend and girlfriend, then we're breaking up. Husband and wife, then I'm going to go start dialing divorce lawyers. Because there's no point in being together without loyalty. Thank you. And so Proposition 2, I think it's Proposition, or maybe it's an AB, but anyways, in California, so it comes out and says that it's a law now, or coming up, it will be a law that pigs hogs have to have a certain amount of space to move around in. Otherwise, they cannot be sold. You can't butcher them. You can't sell the bacon or whatever. You can't have them or sell them. So, which is ridiculous. And we know that this is ridiculous, but how did we get to this point where we actually have legislators that are legislating the amount of square footage for hogs, or for that matter, for chickens or anything else? And it comes from the foundation of animal rights. There is no such thing for two reasons. Number one, animals are not self-conscious beings. Human beings are self-conscious, therefore human beings have rights. The other problem with animal rights is that there's no group rights. There's no such thing as animal rights because there's no such thing as human rights. There's only individual rights. Thank you. So I'm going to go ahead and put this on a sort of a loop. There's certain things that I have in my podcast that I play each and every day, the novena and Who is the True Conservative, because there are things that I want to remind my audience of on a regular basis, and this is going to be one of them. And it has to do, of course, with the three big things that have to do with coronavirus and the government's overreaction to the coronavirus. The three things to keep in mind. Number one is privacy. Human beings have an expectation of privacy because we're the only animal on the planet that is self-conscious. And because of that reasonable expectation of privacy, we have property and property rights. So that's the number one thing is privacy. It's nobody's business whether or not you have a mask, or you're vaccinated. It's nobody's business. So you don't have to run around telling everybody, yes, I do, or no, I don't. You don't have to allow the left to bait you into an adversarial position. Okay? This is what they want. They want the fight. They want the friction. Who's on what side? Who's a masker? Who's an anti-masker and an anti-vaxxer and all that. They want it, and you don't have to play the game. And true conservatives, and I'm the only one, don't. Whether or not I'm vaccinated or whether or not I wear a mask is nobody's business, and that's that. The other part of this, again, is property rights. Since we have an expectation of privacy, we have property and property rights. If I go to my neighbor's house and they want to see proof of vaccination, they want to make sure that I got a mask, maybe a double or triple mask, that's their property. They can do that. If I don't like it, I go somewhere else. That's where it's at. Third thing is that any protests at this point are ill-timed and off the mark. The time to have protested was when the state government decided to create this mechanism to introduce a dictator into the works. Illegal, against the Constitution, and unauthorized. And we shouldn't be putting up with it or listening to it. But the point is that if I'm going to protest, and if anyone else that cares to be to protest is going to, that's the direction to go. That's the timing is now, and the direction you want to point your frustration is at Sacramento. You want to make sure that this doesn't happen again. Because if they can shut the state down for COVID, they can shut it down for global warming, as one of the Canadian truckers pointed out very shrewdly. And so that has to go. There are no dictators in a democracy. They just don't exist. So that has to go. And that's what the true conservative does. We got to point the argument and the frustration and the protests in the right direction at the right time, respect private property, and respect the reasonable expectation of privacy. Thank you. And now there's no free lunch. By contrast, human action, to use the Austrian economic term, is not merely reactive to constraints and utility functions, but active and creative. the exercise of the free and creative and, some of us think, God-given will that can say yes or no. Deidre McCloskey. Embedded in human action because it reflects the image of the Creator is creativity and freedom. This transcends the robotic and instinctive reactions that are needed for us to function and adds a dimension that not only feeds economic life, but also feeds our souls. And that was, there's no free lunch. Thank you. And now, the gorgeous Mosaic. Polite people did not acknowledge the existence of any such thing as an Asian in the 1960s. There were Chinese restaurant owners in small towns across the country and Syrian grocers selling olives on Atlantic Avenue in Brooklyn, Japanese students in medical school in Southern California, and Filipinos counting ammunition at naval bases. But the idea that one broad racial category might stretch to include all the populations from the sands of Sinai to the breadfruit trees of the South Pacific would have seemed, well, it would have seemed like a throwback to the worst days of imperialism, when toupee-wearing sahibs sipped gin on the veranda while talking condescendingly of the Asiatics. It was the civil rights laws of the 1960s that reintroduced Asiatics, suitably named, into American discourse to take their place alongside the four other great categories familiar to anyone who's ever filled out a census form or applied to a university: white, black, Hispanic, Native American. The civil rights movement altered the way Americans perceived themselves and their society as much as it altered the law of the land. It taught Americans to look at each other in radically new ways, to see, for example, those Syrian olive sellers in Atlantic Avenue as having much more in common with the sharecroppers of Mississippi than with the Italian tomato sellers 5 blocks south. Both the Syrian and the sharecroppers were non-whites, and thus entitled to the special protection of the law. As for the Italian, legally speaking, his family might as well have sailed into Massachusetts Bay on the Arabella. Even more significantly, the civil rights movement taught Americans to think in new ways about the workings of society. Before 1965, it would have seemed incredibly odd to describe the disabled, say, as victims of discrimination. No question that the disabled suffered an incredible array of hardships, but those hardships inhered in the disability itself, and being blind or deaf or lacking the use of the arms or legs. They did not arise, as the hardships of South blacks did, from the bias in the law. Indeed, the disabled were entitled to a broad array of benefits from government. If they had been injured in war, they drew a veterans benefit. If they had been railway employees, the government had a special fund for that. And if they had not served either in the armed forces or on the rails, they still qualified for a Social Security disability pension. And again, unlike Southern blacks who faced the disdain and hostility of their neighbors, the disabled could often count on the sympathy of their fellow citizens. Before they could see themselves as maltreated by the law, they and the rest of society had to reach a new understanding of what fair treatment meant. President Johnson introduced the American public to the new understanding in his justly famous 1965 commencement address at Howard University. You do not have to take a person who, for years, has been hobbled by chains and liberate him, bringing him up to the starting line of a race and then say, you are free to compete with all the others, and still justly believe that you have been completely fair. This is the next and more profound stage of the battle for civil rights. We seek not just equal equity, but human ability, not just equality as a right and a theory, but equality as a fact and equality as a result. Within weeks of his speech, the Duke Power Company in North Carolina offered the administration and the courts an opportunity to live up to Johnson's pledge. Duke Power had for many years excluded blacks from all but the most menial of employments. On July 2, 1965, the day the Civil Rights Act of 1964 came into effect, Duke Power swept away its old, frankly discriminatory hiring policy and replaced it with a new, ostensibly neutral one. All applicants for non-menial jobs had to have a high school diploma or achieve a certain minimum mark on an IQ test. In rural North Carolina in the mid-60s, this new policy reserved the best jobs for whites very nearly as effectively as the straightforward racial bias. The NAACP Legal Defense Fund, with the Department of Justice's support, sued Duke Power. In March 1971, the NAACP and the U.S. government won the verdict they had sought. Practices, procedures, or tests neutral on their face and even neutral in terms of intent, the Supreme Court declared in Griggs v. Duke Power, cannot be maintained if they operate to freeze the status quo of prior discriminatory employment policies. It was Duke Power's responsibility to figure out a test for promotion that the blacks could pass in the same proportion as whites. And if that test turned out to be less convenient or effective than high school promotion, too bad. Griggs redefined discrimination from an intentional to an unintentional wrong. Before that lawsuit was filed, most employers could feel reasonably sure so long as they treated black and white applicants and employees equally, judging all by the same standard, they were acting fairly. Griggs served notice that the equal treatment no longer sufficed. Employers and everyone else with benefits to dispense must make allowances for the special circumstances of black Americans if they hoped to avoid accusations of discrimination. In itself, this was not an unreasonable proposition. The world, after all, was not created in 1965. The gap between the attainments of blacks as a group and whites as a group did not arise from the mysterious workings of fate, but from 3 centuries of deliberate oppression by the white majority. On the other hand, the gaps were there, and even conscientious employers could hardly avoid noticing them. Back in a minute. Thank you. Federal civil rights agencies had begun promoting quotas as an emergency remedy to extreme discrimination in 1969 when Secretary of Labor George Shultz wearied of negotiating with the militantly anti-black construction unions of Philadelphia and finally ordered them simply to enroll a certain number of blacks in each of their locals or else. Soon the Labor Department was forcing quotas on unions from Long Island to California. After the Duke Power case, the lower courts were emboldened to order up quota plans too. Bridgeport, Connecticut got one of the first. In 1973, when a federal judge decreed that half the new hires of the city's police department must be black or Puerto Rican. In April 1974, the Department of Justice and the United Steelworkers of America agreed to the biggest quota plan to date, governing all of the country's 350,000 unionized steelmaking jobs. By then, employers had got the message. Why wait to be sued by your employees or the government? A quota plan provided by the best possible, the only reliable insurance against an accusation of discrimination. True, a badly divided Supreme Court declared in its 1978 Bakke case that public institutions like universities could not make use of rigid numerical targets, but it said also that goals and timetables for the sake of diversity were acceptable. Promptly, every law school, medical school, graduate school, and college began developing goals and timetables. The very next year, in the Weber v. United Steelworkers case, the court announced that the private employers could use rigid numerical targets so long as they did so voluntarily. The year after that, 1980, the court declared an explicit 10% racial quota in federal contracting to be okay. Those 3 cases left civil rights law in such a gnarled and tangled state that nobody could quite be sure what was legal and what was not. And, more important in the end, who was demanding and enforcing these plans. Bakke and Weber together created powerful incentives for public institutions and private corporations to lie, to pretend that they were not maintaining quotas when in fact they were, to pretend that those quotas were voluntary when in fact they had been surrendered to under the threat of the federal lawsuit. By the end of the 1970s, the country was governed by an elaborate undeclared law enforced by nobody knew whom. Presidents, cabinet officers, congressmen, even the justices of the Supreme Court denounced quotas, and yet, with every passing year, they spread and grew. The white resentment provoked by quotas may explain the strong mood of the racial pessimism that gripped blacks in the 1970s. Even as the black middle class flourished and the number of the black college graduates doubled, 60% of surveyed blacks said there had been real change in their position in 1964. By 1976, only 32% of blacks answered that question affirmatively. Only 8% of a sample of black leaders surveyed by the Harris poll in 1978 agreed that racism in the United States was declining. Between 1968 and 1978, the percentage of blacks who felt that they had experienced discrimination at work consistently rose. Large as black-white differences loomed in the 1970s, they were adventitious and fated to disappear. But there were other differences that were never going to disappear, between men and women, between adults and children, between the able-bodied and the disabled. Disparate impact was the weapon that would be used to attack them all. During the legislative battle over what would become the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the bill's wiliest opponent, Representative Howard W. Smith of Virginia, chairman of the House Rules Committee, sought to sabotage it by proposing to include the word sex after race, religion, creed, and national origin on its list of prohibited grounds of discrimination. Smith knew that Republicans would have to vote in favor of this amendment to their party's envelopes were stuffed, its doorbells rung, and its voters driven to the polls by middle-class Protestant at-home mothers who would have been alienated and offended by any hint of backsliding on women's rights. The Republican National Convention endorsed an Equal Rights for Women amendment to the Constitution in 1944 and reaffirmed that commitment every 4 years until 1980. Banning discrimination on the grounds of sex, however, was poison to Northern Democrats. Their mostly blue-collar constituents saw the Equal Rights for Women campaign as an attack on the restrictive practices of their trade unions, which ensured that the best-paying jobs went to men with families to support. The Democratic National Convention would not endorse the ERA until 1972. So Smith plotted an obstructionist two-step. First, trap feminist Republicans into voting with mischief-making Southern Democrats to add the killer amendment. Second, the unpalatable amendment then forces labor-oriented Northern Democrats to vote with segregationist Southern Democrats to defeat the bill as a whole. Very clever, but in the end, not clever enough. The act passed. At first, the sex provisions of the 1964 Act worked in exactly the equal opportunity way that their moderate Republican proponents had hoped. In January 1971, the Supreme Court delivered its first ruling on the sex provisions of the 1964 Act, declaring it a violation of the law for companies to refuse to hire women with preschool children unless they also refuse to hire equally situated men. The act, the court said, prohibits firms from maintaining one hiring policy for women and another for men. In 1971, a federal judge in Ohio told General Electric that it could no longer be bound by a state law that barred women from jobs that required the lifting of objects weighing more than 25 pounds. The section of the law that required lunch breaks for women but not men was voided as well. That same month, a state judge in Pittsburgh told the city's newspapers that the venerable practice of printing separate job listings for men and women was illegal, and within a few more months, a newspaper convention older than the headline had vanished from the country's press. In May, the U.S. Civil Service Commission ordered the federal government to drop men-only and women-only designations for public sector jobs. The spirit of equality quickly moved beyond the job market. In November 1971, the Supreme Court invoked the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment to strike down for the first time a state law that discriminated against women, an Idaho statute that favored male relatives over female relatives in deciding who should administer the estates of those who died without a will. The U.S. House of Representatives passed the Equal Rights Amendment in October 1971. The Senate voted 84-8 in favor of the amendment in March 1972, after first defeating by a large margin provisions suggested by Senator Sam Ervin of North Carolina to exempt women from the draft. President Nixon endorsed the ERA at once, and by the end of the year, it was speeding through the state legislatures. In February 1972, the government printing office approved use of the new feminist honorific Ms. in government documents. In the spring of 1978, the Census Bureau announced that the 1980 census would eliminate the line asking for the name of the head of the household. The Weather Service decided in 1978 that henceforth it would give hurricanes both male and female names. It didn't take long, however, for Americans to begin noticing that the attempt to eradicate male-female differences was not going to be quite so morally straightforward as the elimination of Jim Crow. In June 1975, federal civil rights officials warned the public schools of Scottsdale, Arizona, that their end-of-term father-son, mother-daughter baseball games and picnics were prohibited by the 1964 Act. Back in a minute. Thank you. President Gerald Ford quickly intervened, and the incident got laughed off as a bit of overzealous officiousness. But applying the civil rights model to the sexes threw up one such eyebrow-raising result after another. In September 1974, the first female corrections officer went to work in a men's maximum security prison. Melissa Ludke, a reporter with Sports Illustrated, won a court order before the 1978 World Series, commanding professional baseball to open its clubhouse locker rooms to female reporters. Professional basketball, football, and hockey quickly fell into step. In January 1978, a federal judge in Dayton, Ohio, ruled that it was unconstitutional for high schools to deny qualified girls a place on boys' athletic teams, even when they maintained girls' teams in the same sports. Few of the cautious but fair-minded Americans who had nervously welcomed women's lib at the beginning of the decade could have imagined that the campaign for equal rights for women could treat an all-boy Little League team or a men's lunch club as the functional equivalent of Little Rock High School. As it became clear that that's exactly how the campaigners for female equality saw these institutions, the popular enthusiasm for the campaign perceptibly subsided. By the end of 1974, the most visible symbol of that campaign, the Equal Rights Amendment, was faltering politically. The ERA had been badly injured in the Supreme Court's Roe v. Wade decision in January 1973. It is telling that of the 35 states that ultimately ratified the ERA, 22 did so in the 10 months before Roe v. Wade, and only 13 in the 10 years after. It didn't help either that the leaders of the ERA campaign seemed so indifferent to the anxieties of middle-aged, middle-class women worried that the amendment could be used to outlaw alimony and end the bias in favor of maternal custody in divorce proceedings. But what really finished the amendment off was the constant flow of stories like the one at the Scottsdale picnics. North Dakota ratified the ERA in January 75. It was the amendment's last victory. 7 states, Arizona, Georgia, Louisiana, Nevada, Oklahoma, Utah, and Virginia, rejected the ERA in the next 6 weeks. Idaho and Kentucky voted to join Nebraska and Tennessee and rescind their ratification. As the time limit dribbled away, the battle for the ERA closed in on Illinois, the only large industrial state not to have ratified. Illinois happened to be the home of Phyllis Schlafly. Schlafly was not the sort of person feminists found it easy to take seriously. A devout Catholic, a mother of 6, a self-described housewife, she wore her hair in a bouffant, wore pastel suits with large buttons, pumps, and pink lipstick, and began speeches by thanking her husband, Dr. John Schlafly, for giving her permission to be away from home that day. In other words, she incarnated her own person, in her own person, everything that the advocates of the ERA found retrograde, stupid, and maddening. Unfortunately for them, she also happened to be something none of them were, a genuine grassroots political organizer who had devoted 20 years to intrastate politicking. And she had filing cabinets full of Scottsdale-like bureaucratic absurdities. Still, in the end, Schlafly would have saved her breath, or could have saved her breath. The ERA was defeated, but the federal courts proceeded to decide cases as if it had won. In 1976, the Supreme Court, by a 7-2 majority, struck down an Oklahoma law that permitted women to buy 3.2% alcohol beer when they turned 18 while requiring men to wait to age 21. Justice Brennan used the case to declare for the majority that from now on, any law that treated men and women differently would be squinted at suspiciously by the courts. Classifications by gender must serve important governmental objectives and must be substantially related to the achievement of those objectives. Brennan described this new squinting as an intermediate scrutiny, not as strict as the scrutiny the court gave to laws that made distinctions between blacks and whites, but much stricter than the scrutiny given to, say, laws that made distinctions between the steel industry and the aluminum industry. For all practical purposes, Brennan's intermediate scrutiny was every bit as lethal to pre-feminist laws as the ERA itself would have been. After all, the Oklahoma law sought to reduce male traffic fatalities, an important objective, and banning drinking by college-age boys was certainly related to the achievement of that objective. If so, elementary, a sex-based distinction could not survive intermediate scrutiny, then no sex-based distinction could. Delaying beer drinking by Oklahoma girls until their 21st birthday was, however, an awfully circuitous route to the unisex utopia. Unlike the racial divide, sexual divide corresponded to something deep and real about men and women. Feminists have to question not just all of Western culture, but the organization of culture itself, and further, even the very organization of nature. The radical feminist Shulamith Firestone audaciously argued in 1970. And questioning nature was exactly what the new civil rights law of disparate impact did. Americans over a certain age are often surprised to see diminutive women patrolling their city's meanest streets. The policemen of their childhood were tall, commanding figures. Have the cops shrunk? Well, yes. In March 1973, the Federal Law Enforcement Assistance Administration issued an order forbidding any local police department that received federal funds that is, all of them, to maintain minimum height requirements. The rules disqualified too many women. In 1977, the Supreme Court seconded LEAA by striking down Alabama's minimum height requirement as a violation of the 1964 Act. The federal government lived up to its own principles. In 1971, it waived size and strength requirements for its own police forces. In 1977, New York City acceded to a judicial order and permitted women to apply for firefighting jobs. None of the applicants passed the department's strength test, so the judge ordered the strength test made easier until sufficient numbers of the women could pass. In July 1978, Judge John Sirica of Watergate fame struck down as unconstitutional the law that barred women from serving on any naval vessel except hospital and transport ships. The first female Sea Dog shipped out on the USS Vulcan in September. Of the 55 women aboard the Vulcan, 10 became pregnant within their first 4 months aboard. Back in a minute. Thank you. Who is the socialist? He is the man that seeks consensus. He is subjective, petty, and small, taking everything in life personally. He's outrageous, boring, and rude. He pretends to be a leader and a change agent. He pretends that he's your friend. He is sly, cunning, and deceptive. He dresses, acts, and speaks like a slob. He's informal and terminally unique. He is childish and pretends that he knows nothing. He has no conscience and pretends that might makes right and that the ends justify the means. He's impulsive and rationalizes his behavior. He's deterministic, blaming others for his mistakes. He's skeptical, demanding that others solve his problems. His unreasonableness and irresponsibility make him a bad role model, bad father, brother, family member, friend, and a bad person, period. So if you think that you can be friends with a socialist, think again. Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there, reminding you to be honest, to be smart, to be beautiful, and to remember that the left has no authority, no power, and they can't win.